We woke up on the first morning of 1950, and we did not yet know that we were standing at the edge of the most important decade in modern American life. We did not know that within 12 months we would be at war again. We did not know that the man across the street would start digging a hole in his backyard for reasons he would not explain. We did not know that the strange new box in the corner of the living room would change the way American families spent their evenings forever. We just knew it was cold, and the percolator was bubbling on the stove, and the morning paper had landed on the front step with that soft, familiar thwap, and the radio was murmuring something cheerful about the new year and the new decade. We poured our coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. We looked across at our husband or our wife or our father, and we felt something we had not felt in a very long time. We felt safe. We had won the biggest war in human history 5 years earlier. We had survived the depression that came before it. We had been knocked flat by 2 enormous disasters back to back, and we had gotten up both times. And now, finally, in 1950, the bills were getting paid and the icebox was full and the kids were in their own beds in their own bedrooms in a house with our name on the deed. The man of the house had a job. The woman of the house had a kitchen full of new appliances. The kids had shoes that fit. The dog had a yard. A gallon of gas cost 27 cents. A new house cost about $7,300. A loaf of bread was 14 cents. A pound of bacon was 56 cents. A new Chevrolet sedan rolled off the lot for $1,510. The average American family earned about $3,300 a year. And the miracle of 1950, the miracle nobody fully understood at the time, was that those numbers worked. One paycheck, one job, one man going off to the factory or the office or the shop in the morning and coming home at 5:30 in the evening could put a roof over a family of 4, food on the table, clothes on everyone's back, gas in the car, and still leave enough left over for the Saturday matinee and a fishing trip in July. We did not know we were living through a brief, beautiful, almost impossible moment in American economic history. We just thought this was how things were going to be from now on. Forever. We could not see what was coming. None of us could. This is the story of 1950. The year America was just getting started. January came in cold. That was nothing new. January is always cold. But the cold of January 1950 had a different quality to it. It was the first January in 11 years that was not happening inside a global emergency. The Depression had ended. The war had ended. Now we were just here, in our houses, in our towns, in our country, with a future stretching out ahead of us that we could actually plan for. We could buy things on January 1st that we expected to still own on January 1st of next year. We could put money in the bank and trust that it would be there in the morning. We could look at our children and imagine them grown without imagining them in uniform. The newspaper that landed on the front step that first morning of the new decade was full of small, ordinary news. Bowl games, weather reports, a holdup at a grocery store in Brooklyn. Truman was in the White House. Eisenhower was president of Columbia University. Joe DiMaggio was thinking about retiring. Tracy and Hepburn had a new movie coming out. It was the kind of news you read with your coffee and then folded up and put aside without remembering any of it, which was exactly the kind of news we wanted to read. The country was bigger than it used to be. The 1950 census, which would be taken in April, would count over 151 million Americans. That was 19 million more than in 1940. The babies that had started arriving after the war were now toddlers and preschoolers, and there were more of them than anyone had ever seen. The maternity wards had been full for 4 straight years. The pediatricians could not keep up. The diaper services were running double shifts. We did not yet have the phrase baby boom, but we were living through it, and our houses were filling up. Television was still a curiosity in January 1950. About 9% of American homes had a set. That meant 9 out of every 10 homes did not. The ones who did have one were the talk of the neighborhood. The kids would walk past the picture window after school and look in to see what was on. The parents would invite the neighbors over on Tuesday nights to watch Milton Berle on the Texaco Star Theater. The Berle Show was the most popular thing on television. He did not yet have any real competition because the competition had not been invented. We sat in our friends' living rooms with cups of coffee, watching a man in a dress make jokes on a small flickering screen, and we laughed and we marveled. Then we walked home through the cold, our breath visible in the streetlight, and we thought about whether we could afford one of those sets ourselves. A console television cost around $200 in 1950. That was a serious amount of money, about 6 weeks of an average paycheck. We thought about it. We did the math at the kitchen table. Some of us decided yes. Most of us decided not yet. The radio still ruled in most American homes. The family gathered around the big wooden console in the evening and listened to Jack Benny, Fibber McGee and Molly, the Lone Ranger, Suspense. The radio was a friend you had known your whole life. The radio knew how to behave in your living room. It did not demand your eyes. It let you keep knitting, keep doing the crossword, keep cooking dinner, keep doing your homework. We were comfortable with the radio. The television, well, the television felt different. The television wanted everything. That same January, an unknown 22-year-old singer named Tony Bennett recorded his first songs for Columbia Records. We did not know him yet. He would be on every radio station by 1951. The decade was full of young people getting ready to break out, and we did not see any of them coming. We just lived our lives. Outside the houses, the streets of America were quieter than they would ever be again. The interstate highway system was still 6 years away from being signed into law. The roads we had were 2-lane blacktop running through the heart of every small town. If you wanted to drive from New York to California, you went through Main Street after Main Street. You stopped at diners run by families. You filled up at gas stations where a man came out in a uniform and pumped your gas and washed your windshield and checked your oil and chatted with you about the weather. You spent the night at small motor courts on the edge of town, the kind with separate little cabins and a neon sign by the highway. The trip took 10 days. Nobody was in a hurry yet. The decade had not taught us to hurry. In late January, a man named William Levitt was putting the finishing touches on a development called Levittown out on Long Island. He had built 17,000 houses in 3 years. All of them looked the same. All of them sat on identical plots. All of them came with appliances built in, a tree in the front yard, and a mortgage that a working man could actually afford. The houses cost $7,990 each. You could put down $100 and take possession. Veterans got even better deals through the GI Bill. They could move in with no money down. The whole idea felt almost too good to be true. People had grown up renting walk-up apartments in cities. People had grown up sharing bathrooms down the hall. People had grown up in tenement housing where the floors slanted and the walls were thin, and the landlord did whatever he felt like doing. And now, Levitt was offering them a separate house with a private bathroom and a yard for less money per month than they were already paying in rent. The lines wrapped around the block. The waiting list was thousands of names long. The first wave of Americans was about to become homeowners. And the suburb, that uniquely American invention, was about to explode across the country. The country looked at Levittown and saw the future. Other developers copied the model. Park Forest outside Chicago. Lakewood outside Los Angeles. Within 5 years, there would be Levittowns, or imitations of them outside every major American city. The pattern was always the same. Cape Cod or ranch-style houses. Identical floor plans, 2 or 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a picture window in the front, a small yard in the back, a driveway for the car you were going to buy as soon as you moved in. We had been waiting our whole lives for this. We just didn't know we had been waiting until it actually arrived. February brought the first real chill of the new decade, and it didn't come from the weather. On February 9th, a Republican senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy gave a speech to the Ohio County Republican Women's Club in Wheeling, West Virginia. He held up a piece of paper. He claimed it contained the names of 205 communists working inside the United States State Department. He waved the paper. He raised his voice. He told the room that the country was being subverted from within. Almost nobody noticed at the time. The speech was in a small town. The newspaper that covered it ran a short item on an inside page. McCarthy was not yet famous. He was a freshman senator with a bad reputation among his colleagues. Most people had never heard of him. But the piece of paper would not go away. McCarthy gave the speech again in Salt Lake City a few days later. The number on the list changed. Now it was 57 names. Then it was 81. Then it was something else. He could not seem to keep the number consistent. But the headlines started to spread. There was a list. There were communists. They were already inside the government. They had infiltrated our institutions. They were planning to bring down the country from the inside. We sat at our kitchen tables and we read about it in the newspaper. Some of us laughed it off. Some of us nodded grimly. Some of us said, "Well, you have to wonder." We did not know yet that this man with his piece of paper was about to define an entire decade of American paranoia. We did not know that within 4 years, he would terrorize Hollywood and the universities and the government and our own neighborhoods. We just thought he was loud, and Wisconsin was a long way away. But the fear was already there in the country. McCarthy did not create the Red Scare. McCarthy just figured out how to ride it. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in August of 1949. 6 months before McCarthy waved his piece of paper, the American monopoly on the bomb was over. We were no longer the only country that could destroy the world, and we had not been ready for that. We had spent 4 years, from 1945 to 1949, walking around as the only nuclear power on Earth, and we had gotten used to it. Now the Russians had it too, and we had to ask ourselves, how did they get it? They were not supposed to be able to make one for at least another 10 years, so how did they do it? The answer most Americans came to was, somebody helped them. Somebody on our side. Somebody who must still be on our side, still working inside government, still helping them. And so, when McCarthy raised his piece of paper in February, the country was already primed to believe him. We had been waiting for someone to give a name to the fear that had been seeping under the door. The fear got worse a few weeks later. On February 3rd, a German-born physicist named Klaus Fuchs confessed in London that he had been passing atomic secrets to the Soviets since 1942. Fuchs had worked on the Manhattan Project. He had been at Los Alamos. He had handed the Soviets the technical specifications of the atomic bomb. The confession was front-page news in every American paper. So it was real. The traitors were real. The Russians had not figured out the bomb on their own. Somebody had given it to them, and if Klaus Fuchs had done it, who else had? The FBI started pulling threads. The threads led to a courier named Harry Gold. Gold led to a soldier named David Greenglass. Greenglass led to his sister Ethel and her husband Julius Rosenberg. By the end of the year, they would be in jail. Within 3 years, they would be in the electric chair. But all of that was still in the future. In February 1950, all we knew was that there were spies, and they had given the Soviets the bomb. And McCarthy said there were more of them, and we did not know who to trust. This was the year we started checking the political views of our neighbors. We started looking sideways at the man who subscribed to too many magazines. We started wondering about the school teacher who had been to a meeting in college. We started thinking about which of our friends had relatives in the wrong countries. The decade of suspicion was beginning. We did not yet know we were inside it. The same month, on the other side of the world, a French paratrooper colonel named Bigard was preparing to be dropped into a place we had never heard of called Indochina. The French were fighting a war there against a communist insurgency led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Truman approved $15 million in military aid to the French effort that spring. We barely registered the story. We did not know that we would be sending our own boys to that same country in less than 15 years. We did not know that name yet. We would learn it. We would never forget it. But February was not just about the Cold War. February was also about ordinary American life going on. The new Mercury Monterey was on the dealer lots, all curves and chrome and pride. Sammy Kaye and Patti Page were on the radio. We listened to Tennessee Waltz over and over, The song would become the biggest hit of the year. It would sell 6 million copies. We danced to it in our kitchens with the percolator humming. We danced to it at high school sock hops where the teenagers held each other at arm's length under the watchful eye of the chaperone. We danced to it at weddings and anniversaries. The song had a way of finding its way into the slowest, softest moments of our lives. The Saturday Evening Post was on the coffee table in every middle-class American living room. The cover that month featured a Norman Rockwell painting. We loved Rockwell because Rockwell loved us. He painted us the way we wanted to see ourselves. Clean, decent, hard-working, family-loving, dog-having, kind to strangers Americans. The Rockwell paintings did not lie exactly. They just showed us the part of the picture we wanted to look at. Down at the corner drugstore, the soda fountain was still busy on Saturday afternoons. The teenagers came in after the matinee at the movie theater and ordered cherry cokes and root beer floats and ice cream sundaes. The fountain man wore a paper hat and a white apron and called them all by their first names. He had known them since they were children. He had served their parents the same drinks 20 years earlier. The soda fountain was a small institution in every American town. We did not yet know it was about to start dying. We just sat at the counter and twirled on the chrome stools and drank our 15-cent malts and thought everything would be the same forever. March came in like a lion, as it always did. The wind cut through the new suburban subdivisions and rattled the kitchen windows and pushed the laundry on the lines until it was nearly horizontal. We hauled in coal for the furnace. The heavy thump of the shovel and the metallic ring of the bucket familiar sounds in the basement of every American home. The newer houses had oil heat, which was cleaner and easier. The old houses still ran on coal. The coal truck came once a month in the winter, the driver in his coveralls and his cap, the chute clattering down to the basement window, the load roaring into the bin like a small avalanche. We were starting to see the first credit cards that year. The Diners Club card had been introduced just a few weeks earlier in February, the brainchild of a businessman named Frank McNamara. He had been at a restaurant in New York and forgotten his wallet. He came up with the idea of a small card you could carry that proved you would pay later. The first Diners Club cards were cardboard. 200 people got them. By the end of 1950, the number would be 10,000. By the end of the decade, hundreds of thousands. We looked at this small piece of cardboard and we could not quite understand it. You ate the meal. The waiter wrote the bill. You handed him the card instead of cash. He took down the number. The bill came in the mail at the end of the month. You paid it then. It felt strange. It felt almost dishonest. Our parents had taught us never to spend money you did not have. The whole basis of American working-class life was the iron rule that you waited until payday, and you paid cash, and you owned what you bought. The credit card was something different. The credit card said, maybe you do not need to wait. Maybe you can have the thing now. Maybe it is okay to borrow against your future self. In 1950, most of us shook our heads at the credit card. We were not ready for it. We were Depression children. We remembered what happened when people borrowed too much. We remembered the soup lines and the bank failures and the suicides off the bridges. We kept our money in our wallets and we paid for our meals at the table and we did not run a tab anywhere. But the seed had been planted. The card existed. Within a generation, we would be carrying a wallet full of them and not thinking twice. The slow rewiring of the American relationship with money had begun in February 1950, and most of us never noticed. In March, the Korean peninsula was quiet. There was tension between the communist North and the American-backed South. The 38th parallel divided the country, a line drawn on a map at the end of the Second World War by two young American officers consulting an atlas in the back of a room. The two Koreas were not friendly. There were skirmishes along the border throughout the spring, but no major fighting yet. Most Americans could not have located Korea on a map if you handed them an atlas. The State Department in March was more focused on Europe. The Marshall Plan, which had been pumping billions of American dollars into rebuilding Western Europe since 1948, was working. France was recovering. Italy was stabilizing. West Germany, the part of Germany the Allies had kept after the war, was starting to show signs of an economic miracle that would eventually be called exactly that. The Russians had locked their part of the continent behind the Iron Curtain. East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. We watched those countries disappear behind that curtain one by one in the late 40s. We had decided we could not let any more of Europe go. That was the doctrine. Containment. Hold the line where it was. Don't push back the communists, but don't let them push any further. It was a strange new way of fighting a war. We had spent the previous decade learning how to fight a total war, a war of unconditional surrender. Now we were being asked to fight a war that had no end point. A war that would just go on, year after year, with no surrender and no parade. Most of us did not understand it. Most of us did not need to. We had jobs to do. We went to the factory or the office or the shop. We came home. We ate dinner with our families. We turned on the radio. We listened to the news for a few minutes. We turned it off when it got too depressing. We had earned our peace. We were going to enjoy it. The newspapers in March were full of advertisements that captured the year better than any history book ever could. Refrigerators with names like Frigidaire and Kelvinator and Westinghouse glowing on full-page spreads, the housewife smiling beside her open freezer compartment, the children grinning at the milk inside. Stoves with 8 burners and double ovens. Washing machines that promise to do the work of an entire wash day in a single hour. Vacuum cleaners that promise to reduce your housework by half. The advertisements all said the same thing, in slightly different words. This product will make your life better. This product will make you happier. This product will make your family love you more. We bought them. We bought them by the millions. The factories that had been making tanks and bombs 5 years earlier were now making refrigerators and stoves. The same workers who had built the planes that won the war were now building the appliances that would fill our kitchens. American industry was the strongest in the world. Nobody else could touch us. Europe was rebuilding. Japan was rebuilding. The Soviets were starving. China had just had a communist revolution and was eating itself. The United States made half of everything manufactured on the planet. Half. We had no real competition anywhere, and we used that economic dominance to fill our homes with the most extraordinary collection of consumer goods that any people had ever owned. The first credit unions for working-class families were spreading too. The unions were strong. Union membership in 1950 was at its all-time peak. Over a third of all American workers belonged to a union. The unions had won the 8-hour day, the 40-hour week, paid vacations, sick days, pensions, health insurance. The factory worker in 1950 was making more money in real terms than the factory worker had ever made before or would ever make again. Most of us did not know that we were living through the peak. We thought it was just the beginning. March ended with the trees still bare and the temperatures still cold, but the days getting longer. Light coming through the picture windows in the afternoon in a way it had not since October. The kids on the block riding their bicycles up and down the new sidewalks, their wheels rattling on the seams of the concrete, the playing cards' clothes pinned to their spokes, flapping with that satisfying motor sound. We watched them from the porch with our coffee. We thought, this is what we won the war for. This is what all of it was for. We were right. We were also wrong. We would not understand the full picture for another 20 years. April brought the spring. April also brought the census takers. Every 10 years, the United States counts its people. April 1950 was no exception. The census takers walked door to door across the country with their clipboards and their fountain pens. They knocked on the screen doors of every house. They asked the same questions. How many people live here? What are their ages? What are their occupations? How much do they earn? Were they born in this country? Were their parents born in this country? How many years of school have they completed? The 1950 census would count 151,325,798 Americans, up from 132 million in 1940. We had added almost 20 million people in a decade, mostly in the last 5 years. The country was growing faster than it had ever grown in peacetime. The census would also reveal the Great Migration. The black population of the North had nearly doubled since the war. Black families had left the segregated South by the millions, riding the trains north to Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and New York, looking for factory jobs and a chance to live a life that did not require them to step off the sidewalk when a white person walked by. They were finding the jobs. They were not always finding the rest. The northern cities had their own form of segregation, less visible than the South but no less real. Black families could not buy houses in the new suburbs. Restrictive covenants were written into every property deed in Levittown. Black families could not get the same mortgages from the same banks. Black families could not work in the same factories at the same wages. This was the country we were not yet ready to talk about. The country that existed alongside the prosperity, parallel to it, in the same cities, sometimes on the same streets, but invisible to most of the people who lived in the suburbs we were building. We pulled into our driveways with our bags of groceries and our station wagons full of children, and we did not see the other America. We were not being asked to see it, not yet. But April was also the month that one black soldier did something most of us did not even register at the time. On April 18th, an 18-year-old Army private named Curt Flood, who would later become one of the great outfielders in baseball history, played in his first minor league game. He would face brutal racism in the Southern leagues. He would survive it. He would go on to challenge the reserve clause in baseball that bound players to their teams like property. He would change professional sports forever. We did not know any of that yet. We just glanced at the box scores and moved on. The baseball season was starting. The Cleveland Indians and the New York Yankees were the favorites in the American League. The Brooklyn Dodgers and the Philadelphia Phillies were the favorites in the National. We followed the games on the radio in the evenings, the announcer's voice rising and falling, the crack of the bat reaching us through the speaker like a small explosion. Baseball in 1950 was still the national pastime. Football was a college game that did not really exist on Sundays. Basketball was a niche sport played mostly in cold weather cities by tall white men with crew cuts. Baseball was the only major league sport with a season that mattered, and it mattered to everyone. The Phillies that year had a young pitching staff called the Whiz Kids. They would go on to win the National League pennant. They would lose the World Series to the Yankees in 4 straight games, but the season would feel like a triumph for Philadelphia anyway. The Yankees had Joe DiMaggio, who was approaching the end of his career. They had a rookie shortstop named Phil Rizzuto, who was at his peak. They had Yogi Berra catching and Allie Reynolds pitching. The Yankees were the Yankees. We listened to their games on the radio, and we either loved them or hated them, depending on where we lived. There was no middle ground with the Yankees in 1950. The first Peanuts comic strip ran in 7 newspapers in October of 1950. Charles Schulz had been drawing for years for smaller markets. The new strip featured a kid named Charlie Brown and his dog and a few neighborhood children. Some of us noticed it, most of us did not. We had no way of knowing that this small daily strip would become the most beloved comic in the history of newspapers. We just turned the page and read Dick Tracy and Blondie and the Phantom. In April, the airwaves were full of music we have never quite gotten over. Patti Page singing The Tennessee Waltz. Nat King Cole singing Mona Lisa. Frank Sinatra singing whatever Frank Sinatra was singing. Hank Williams was at the peak of his hard, doomed career, singing songs about loneliness and loss in a voice that sounded like it had walked 1,000 miles to find you. Williams was 26 years old in April of 1950 and had less than 3 years left to live. He would die on New Year's Day 1953 in the back of his Cadillac, killed by alcohol and painkillers and exhaustion. We did not know any of that yet. We just bought his records. We bought them on 78 RPM shellac discs that broke if you dropped them. The new 45 RPM single had just been introduced by RCA the year before, and the new 33 1/3 RPM long-playing album had been introduced by Columbia the year before that. The record industry was in the middle of a format war. We did not know which speed would win. So for a while, we owned record players that played all three speeds, the turntable with the little adjustment lever to switch between them. We bought records in all three formats. We piled them up, we played them and danced in our kitchens while the dinner cooked on the new electric stove. By April, almost everyone in the new suburban developments had a telephone in the house. The party line was still common, especially in rural areas. You picked up the receiver and you might hear your neighbor having a conversation. You either hung up politely, or if you were a certain kind of person, you put your hand over the mouthpiece and listened. The party line was a slow death for privacy. Within a decade, every house would have its own private line. But in 1950, in most of America, the phone in your kitchen was shared with 2 or 3 other families up the road. You could hear what they were saying. They could hear what you were saying. We lived in a world that had not yet figured out how to be alone. In April, Truman was wrestling with a problem the press was not yet calling Korea, but soon would be. The North Korean military was building up along the 38th parallel. American intelligence reports were predicting an invasion within a few months. Truman read the reports. He met with his advisors. He hoped he was wrong. The American military had been demobilized after the war. The army that had defeated Hitler was now a skeleton of itself. Most of the GYS who had fought in Europe and the Pacific had gone home, taken off the uniform, gone back to their farms and factories, gotten married, started families. The army that remained in 1950 was 591,000 men. The Korean Peninsula had to be defended, if it came to that, by units that were mostly inexperienced, mostly under-equipped, mostly stationed in Japan as occupation troops. We did not know any of this. We were not supposed to know it. We just lived our lives and read the front page and folded up the paper and went to work. The new model cars were being unveiled at the auto shows. The 1950 Buick Roadmaster, the 1950 Ford Custom, the 1950 Cadillac Series 62. They had chrome bumpers the size of small couches. They had hood ornaments that looked like rocket ships. They had white wall tires and two-tone paint jobs and dashboards that looked like the cockpit of an airplane. We walked through the showrooms on Saturday afternoons with our wives and our kids, and we ran our hands across the fenders, and we sat in the driver's seats, and we held the steering wheels, and we daydreamed. Most of us could not afford a new car. We bought used cars from the corner lot, or we kept driving the pre-war models we had managed to hold on to through the rationing years. The new cars were for the lucky ones, the doctor, the lawyer, the factory foreman, the successful salesman. The rest of us came home from the auto show and looked at our 6-year-old Chevy in the driveway and patted it on the hood and told ourselves it would last another year. And then we put away the auto show brochures and got on with our lives. April ended with the lilacs coming into bloom and the kids out of their winter coats and the weekend lawnmowers starting up for the first time. The smell of cut grass returned to America. The radios were on in the open windows. The percolator was on in the kitchen. The country smelled like spring, and like everything was going to be fine. May brought the longer days and the warmer afternoons and the first major news of the spring. The Atomic Energy Commission announced that the United States would begin building a new generation of nuclear weapons, bigger than the bombs we had dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The hydrogen bomb, the H-bomb, the bomb that would not just destroy a city, but would destroy a region. Truman had authorized the H-bomb project back in January. The announcement in May was a formal acknowledgement that the work was underway. We read about it at the kitchen table. We did not know what to make of it. The atomic bombs had ended the war. We had felt good about them mostly because they had brought our boys home. But the H-bomb was something different. The H-bomb was not a weapon you would use to end a war. The H-bomb was a weapon you would use to end a country. The scientists who had built the atomic bomb in the first place split on the question. Some of them, including Robert Oppenheimer himself, the father of the original bomb, opposed the H-bomb. They thought we were going too far. They thought we were building something we could not control. Other scientists, including Edward Teller, pushed for it. They thought the Russians were going to build one anyway, and we could not afford to be second. Truman went with Teller. The work began. 3 years later, in November 1952, the United States would detonate the first hydrogen bomb. A few months after that, the Soviets would detonate theirs. The arms race was about to enter a new phase. The weapons we were building could not just kill millions of people. They could kill billions. They could change the climate. They could make the planet uninhabitable. We did not know all of this yet in May 1950. We just knew that the bomb was getting bigger. The Civil Defense Administration started running advertisements that month telling Americans how to prepare for a nuclear attack. The advice was practical and useless in equal measure. Stockpile canned food and water. Know the location of the nearest shelter. Cover your eyes if you see a flash. Get under something heavy. Listen for the all clear on the radio. We read the advertisements and we shook our heads. Some of us cut them out and pinned them to the kitchen bulletin board. Most of us threw them away. The advice felt like trying to use an umbrella against a tornado. If the Russians dropped a bomb on our city, we were not going to survive because we had ducked under a table. We knew that. The government knew that. But the government had to do something. So they printed pamphlets and they showed films in the schools and they told everyone to stay calm. The films in the schools were the worst. Bert the Turtle, the cartoon character who showed children how to duck and cover. The teachers led the drills. The children crawled under their desks and put their hands over the backs of their necks. The teacher counted to 10. The children got back up. They went back to their math lesson. We watched this happen to our children, and we felt something we did not have a word for. We had survived the Depression and the war. We had earned our peace. We had built our suburbs and our schools and our churches. And now we were teaching our 6-year-olds to hide under their desks in case the world ended. The contradiction sat in our chests like a stone. We did not talk about it much. There was nothing to say. But May was also the month the strawberries came in and the rhubarb. Our grandmothers were still alive in 1950, and they made strawberry rhubarb pie in the kitchen, the lattice crust on top, the filling bubbling up red through the openings. We ate pie at the back porch table after dinner, the radio playing softly through the open kitchen window, the children chasing fireflies in the dusk. May was a beautiful month in America in 1950. May made you forget about the H-bomb for a few hours at a time. The first international polo match between the United States and Argentina was played that month. We did not care. Polo was a sport for rich people in white pants. We watched baseball. The Korean situation got worse. The North Korean army continued to build up along the parallel. The Soviets had supplied them with tanks and artillery. The South Korean army was a fraction of the size of the North Korean force, and it was not as well equipped. American intelligence was sounding the alarm. Truman read the reports. He still hoped he was wrong. In May, Doris Day had a hit song called "I'll Never Slip Around Again." She was a former big band singer who had become a movie actress and was now becoming a recording star. She had a clean, bright voice that sounded like sunshine on a porch. America loved Doris Day. Doris Day was who we wanted to be: cheerful, hopeful, optimistic, decent. We watched her movies and we listened to her records and we felt better about ourselves. The first Volkswagen Beetles arrived in the United States that year. 2 of them. They arrived at the port of New York. We thought they were a joke. The car looked like a bug. It had a tiny engine in the back. It looked nothing like an American car. American cars were big and chrome and powerful. The Volkswagen looked like something a German child had drawn. We did not see the future arriving. The future arrived anyway. The polio epidemic was getting worse. The summer of 1950 would be one of the worst summers for polio in American history. Almost 33,000 cases, most of them children. We did not know yet how to prevent polio. We did not know how it spread. We had theories. We thought it might be the public swimming pools. We thought it might be the drinking fountains in the schools. We thought it might be the movie theaters where children gathered on Saturdays. We did not know. So we just closed everything. Parents in May started watching for the warning signs: fever, stiff neck, headache, tiredness. Any of those things on a summer morning could send a family into a panic. We took our children to the doctor. The doctor checked them over. Sometimes he sent them home. Sometimes he sent them to the hospital. Sometimes the hospital sent them home in a brace. Sometimes the hospital sent them home in a wheelchair. Sometimes the hospital did not send them home at all. The newspapers ran the polio counts every week. We read them with our coffee. We checked the cases in our state, in our county, in our town. We compared them to last week. We tried to figure out whether things were getting better or worse. The hum-clunk of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind us was the steady metronome of our anxiety. There was a young doctor at the University of Pittsburgh that May, working on a vaccine. His name was Jonas Salk. Almost nobody had heard of him yet. The vaccine was still years away from being tested on humans. But Salk was working. The cure was coming. We did not know it. We just held our children a little tighter that summer. On Saturday, June 24th, the radio interrupted the regular programming. The North Korean Army had crossed the 38th parallel in force. Tanks, infantry, artillery, tens of thousands of soldiers pouring south across the border. The South Korean army was collapsing. Seoul was about to fall. We sat at our kitchen tables with our coffee getting cold, and we listened to the bulletins. We could not believe it. We had just finished the biggest war in human history. 5 years. 5 years was all the peace we had been given, and now we were back at it. Truman was at his home in Independence, Missouri, when the news broke. He flew back to Washington. He met with his cabinet that night at Blair House, where he was staying because the White House was being renovated. He made the decision quickly. The United States would intervene. We would not let South Korea fall. We would not let the communists push us off the Asian continent. The line of containment that we had drawn after the war was going to be defended. Within 72 hours of the invasion, Truman had committed American air and naval forces. Within a week, he had committed ground troops. The United States went to war on the other side of the world for a country most Americans had never heard of, to defend a government most Americans had no opinion about, against an enemy most Americans could not have found on a map a week earlier. The first American soldiers to reach Korea were a small infantry unit called Task Force Smith. They flew in from Japan, where they had been on occupation duty. They were 540 men. They were under-equipped and under-trained. Most of them had not been in combat before. They were sent to delay the North Korean advance until reinforcements could arrive. On July 5th, Task Force Smith met the North Korean army at a place called Osan. They held for a few hours. Then they broke. The North Koreans had T-34 tanks, the same tanks the Soviets had used to crush Hitler's army on the Eastern Front. The Americans had bazookas that bounced off the tank's armor without doing any damage. The Americans had old World War II equipment. The Americans had not been ready for any of this. Task Force Smith lost 150 men in their first hour of combat. They retreated. They retreated for the next 6 weeks. The American army was driven back down the Korean peninsula toward the southern port of Pusan. The North Koreans came on. They took Seoul. They took most of the country. By August, the American and South Korean forces were holding a small perimeter around Pusan, and they had nowhere left to go. If they lost Pusan, they lost the country, and they would have to evacuate by sea. We read all of this in the newspapers. We listened to it on the radio. We watched short black and white newsreels about it at the movie theater before the main feature started. Our boys were over there. Some of them were getting killed. Some of them were getting captured. Some of them were already dead and their families did not know yet. The Korean War in June 1950 was not yet the long, grinding, exhausting conflict it would become. It was still a sudden, shocking surprise. We had been jerked out of our peace. We had been pushed back into uniform. We had been told that the world was not yet safe, and we did not understand why. The men who got called up that summer to go to Korea had mostly been kids during World War II. Many of them had older brothers who had fought. Some of them had fathers who had fought. They knew the stories. They had grown up listening to those stories at the dinner table. They thought they understood war. They had not yet understood what they did not understand. The Korean War would last 3 years. It would kill 36,940 American servicemen. It would wound over 92,000 more. It would never quite end, technically. The fighting would stop in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. The Korean Peninsula would remain divided. The 38th parallel would still be a line on a map 75 years later. We would not win the Korean War. We would not lose it either. We would just stop fighting it. But none of that was known yet in June 1950. In June 1950, all we knew was that the war had started. The bus station goodbyes were happening again. The boys were getting on the trains. Their mothers were standing on the platforms with their hands over their mouths. The wives were watching the children play in the yard and trying not to think about the empty side of the bed they would be sleeping in tonight. The fathers were shaking the hands of their sons and telling them to be careful and not letting their voices break. We had been through it before. We knew the choreography. We knew how to do this. We just had not thought we would have to do it again so soon. The hum-clunk of the refrigerator was the same as it had been on Monday. The percolator made the same sound. The morning paper landed on the porch with the same thwap. The kids went to school. The men went to work. The women went to the grocery store. The country kept turning. But underneath all of it was the steady awareness that somewhere across the ocean, in a country whose name we were only starting to learn how to pronounce, American boys were dying. The casualty lists started appearing in the newspaper. We searched them for names we knew. Sometimes we found one. Sometimes we did not. Either way, the list kept getting longer. July was hot. July was always hot. July 1950 was hotter than usual. The men who had been called up in June were on their way to Korea by July. The big troop transports were leaving from San Francisco and from Seattle and from the East Coast bases. The boys were lined up at the rails of the ships, their duffel bags at their feet, their families on the docks below, waving white handkerchiefs that fluttered like surrender flags in the breeze. The whistles blew. The ships pulled out into the bay. The boys watched their country slide away behind them. Some of them would come back. Some of them would not. The summer of 1950 belonged, more than anything else, to the radio. We turned the radio on first thing in the morning to hear the news from the front. The radio stayed on through breakfast, through the lunch hour, through the news at 6. The radio reported the casualty numbers, the unit movements, the towns lost and the towns gained. We learned the geography of Korea by listening. Suwon, Taijeon, Taegu, Busan, Incheon. We did not know how to spell most of these places, but we knew where they were on the map by the end of July. General Douglas MacArthur was running the war. MacArthur had run the Pacific Theater in World War II. He had accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri 5 years earlier. He had been the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Japan ever since. He was 70 years old in July 1950, and he had not been home to the United States in 14 years. He commanded the Korean War from his headquarters in Tokyo. He flew over to Korea sometimes to inspect the front lines, his corncob pipe clenched in his teeth, his sunglasses on, his open-collared uniform shirt impeccably pressed. MacArthur was a controversial figure. Some Americans thought he was a genius. Some Americans thought he was a megalomaniac. Most Americans in July 1950 did not have an opinion about him because they were too busy trying to figure out what was happening in Korea. MacArthur was the man in charge, and we trusted him because we did not have a choice. Truman trusted him too in July. The trust would not last. Within 9 months, Truman would fire MacArthur for insubordination, and the country would split into camps over the question of who was right. But in July 1950, Truman was still listening to MacArthur, and MacArthur was still telling Truman that the situation was under control. And Truman was telling the American people that the situation was under control. And nobody was sure whether the situation was actually under control or not. The newspapers were full of long articles about Korea. We read them. We folded them up and put them aside. We tried to understand. The country we were fighting for had been part of Japan for 35 years before the war. The country had been split at the end of the war by an agreement between the Soviets and the Americans. The northern half had a communist government installed by the Soviets. The southern half had a non-communist government installed by us. The two halves did not get along. The North had invaded the South. We had decided to defend the South. That was the situation more or less. Most Americans did not have strong feelings about which Korea was right and which was wrong. Most Americans just had strong feelings about not letting the communists win another country. That was the doctrine. Containment. We could not allow another country to fall behind the Iron Curtain. We had to hold the line. Korea was the line. So we fought for Korea. The summer of 1950 was full of small, ordinary American things happening at the same time as the war. The county fairs opened across the Midwest. The carnival came to town. The roller coasters and the Ferris wheels, and the ring toss and the cotton candy. The boys at the fair were the boys who had not yet been called up. The boys at the fair were 16 and 17 years old. They would be called up in 1951 and 1952. They did not know that yet. They were trying to win a stuffed animal for the girl they had brought to the fair. They were going to ride the tilt-a-whirl until they were sick. They were going to come home smelling like fried dough and engine oil. Television was getting bigger. By July, about 11% of American homes had a set. The number was creeping up every month. The shows were still mostly variety hours and game shows. The Texaco Star Theater with Milton Berle was still the biggest. Arthur Godfrey was on every morning. The original amateur hour was on Sunday nights. We watched the small flickering screens with our families, and we ate dinner on TV trays, and we forgot, for a few minutes at a time, about the war. On July 4th, we celebrated independence. We hung the flags from our porches. We grilled hot dogs and hamburgers in the backyard. The kids ran around with sparklers. The fireworks went off down at the high school football field at dusk. We held our hands over our hearts during the national anthem. We meant it more than usual. We had a reason to. Our boys were dying for that flag halfway around the world. We had a reason to remember what it stood for. The Tennessee Waltz was still on every radio. So was Goodnight Irene by the Weavers, a folk group that had recorded a lead belly song and made it the biggest hit of the summer. The Weavers were Pete Seeger and 3 other folk singers. They had a clean, harmonized sound that felt safe and wholesome. By 1953, the Weavers would be blacklisted as communists. Pete Seeger would not work in major American venues for a decade. We would not know any of that yet. We just sang along to Goodnight Irene at the backyard barbecue, all of us together, while the chicken cooked on the grill. Sammy Kaye sang Harbor Lights. Eddie Fisher recorded his first songs. Frank Sinatra was somewhere between 2 phases of his career. Not as hot as he had been in the 1940s. Not yet the comeback star he would become in 1953. He was still on the radio. He was always on the radio. In Hollywood, the movies were starting to feel the heat from television. The big studios were releasing fewer pictures than they had been releasing 5 years earlier. The audiences were not coming as often. Why drive into town and pay 35 cents for a ticket when you could stay home and watch Burl for free? The studios responded by trying to make their movies bigger. More color, wider screens, longer running times. The blockbuster era had not yet begun, but the seeds were being planted. The movie of the summer of 1950 was Sunset Boulevard, directed by Billy Wilder, starring Gloria Swanson and William Holden. We sat in the dark theaters and watched Norma Desmond declare that she was ready for her close-up. We did not yet realize that the movie was about the death of an entire era of Hollywood, and that we were watching it happen in real time. Some of the great stars of the silent film era were old now. Some of them were poor. Some of them were forgotten. Wilder showed us all of it, and we either understood what we were seeing or we did not. Either way, we sat in the dark for 2 hours and we let the movie work on us. In July, the first credit card transactions outside of New York were being processed. The Diners Club card was spreading. Within a year, there would be 200 restaurants accepting it. Within 2 years, there would be 1,000. The slow rewiring of American commerce had begun. The mosquitoes were bad that summer. The kids slathered themselves in Off, the new insect repellent that had been introduced a few years earlier. The screens were on every window. The porches had screen doors that slammed with that familiar slap bang every time a child ran in or out. The country was full of front porches in 1950. They were where we sat in the evenings, on the swings and in the rocking chairs, drinking iced tea and watching the fireflies and waiting for the news to get better. The news did not get better in July. The American forces were pushed back further. The Pusan perimeter was holding barely. Casualty reports continued to come home. The mothers continued to read the names in the paper. But MacArthur was planning something big, something audacious, something that would, in the next month, turn the entire war around. August was the month we held our breath. The Pusan perimeter was the last toehold in Korea. The American and South Korean forces had been pushed into a small area around the southern port of Pusan. They were holding it. Barely. The fighting was savage. The North Koreans threw everything they had at the perimeter, day after day, trying to drive the Americans into the sea. The Americans held. They held by their fingernails. The casualty lists kept growing. The mothers kept reading the papers. The bus stations kept loading boys onto trains. The trains kept moving west toward the Pacific. The ships kept sailing. In the same month, in the rural South, black sharecroppers were planting cotton in the way their grandfathers had planted cotton. In the rural Midwest, farmers were harvesting wheat in fields that stretched to the horizon. In the cities, factory workers were punching time clocks and going home to identical apartment buildings. In the suburbs, the housewives were hanging laundry on lines and waiting for their husbands to come home from work. The country was so big. The country was doing so many different things at the same time. MacArthur had been thinking. He was an old soldier. He had fought in 3 wars now, the First World War, the Second World War, and this new strange war with no parade waiting at the end of it. He was looking at the map of Korea, and he was seeing something that other generals were not seeing. The North Korean army had stretched its supply lines all the way down the peninsula to attack Pusan. The supply lines were thin. The supply lines ran through a single port on the western coast of Korea called Incheon. If the Americans could land troops at Incheon, behind the North Korean army, they could cut the supply lines. The North Korean army would collapse. It was a daring plan. The Joint Chiefs of Staff thought it was crazy. Incheon had a tidal range of 32 feet. The water came in and out of the harbor twice a day, and the harbor was too shallow to land troops except during the highest tides. The window for a landing was 12 hours every 2 weeks. The seawalls were 12 feet high. The harbor was full of mudflats. The approaches were defended by an island called Wolmido that had to be taken first. The whole operation was a logistical nightmare. MacArthur insisted. Truman approved. The Marines began assembling for the largest amphibious landing since World War II. Most Americans did not know any of this in August. The plan was secret. The American press knew vaguely that something was being prepared, but they did not know what. We just kept reading the casualty lists and the frontline reports. We just kept waiting. In August, a 25-year-old singer from Mississippi recorded his first song for a small label in Memphis. His name was Hank Snow. He was a country singer who had been working his way up the ladder for years. By the end of 1950, his song I'm Moving On would be on every country radio station in America. It would stay at #1 for 21 weeks. We hummed it in the kitchen while we washed the dishes. We did not know that the same studio where Hank Snow recorded would 4 years later record a 19-year-old truck driver named Elvis Presley, and that the country was about to be ripped apart by a kind of music we had never heard before. Memphis was about to become important. Memphis was just a town on a river in 1950. The summer was a good summer for baseball. The Phillies were leading the National League. The Yankees were leading the American League. Stan Musial was hitting. Ted Williams was hitting. Joe DiMaggio was hitting, though more slowly than he used to, and we could feel the end of his career approaching the way you feel the end of a long sunset. DiMaggio was 35 years old that summer. He had been the great Yankee Clipper for 14 seasons. He was the husband of half of America's romantic imagination, even though his marriage to a movie actress would not happen for another 4 years. DiMaggio was as close to royalty as American baseball had ever produced. We watched him play because we wanted to remember how he played. In August, the first commercial color television broadcast was made by CBS in New York. The picture was beautiful in the few homes that had a color set to receive it, but almost nobody had a color set. The color sets cost more than $1,000 each. Most American families could barely afford a black and white set, much less a color one. The color revolution would have to wait. It would not arrive in most American living rooms until the late 1960s. The polio epidemic was at its worst in August. The hospitals were full of children in iron lungs. The summer pools were closed. The summer camps were closed. The movie theaters were limiting their audiences. The mothers were keeping their children at home. We had not seen anything like this in years. We were terrified. We listened to the radio for the daily polio count. We checked our children for fevers in the morning. We tried not to think too hard about the news from the hospitals. Some of the children would survive without lasting damage. Some would survive with paralysis. Some would survive in iron lungs that they would not leave for the rest of their lives. Some would not survive at all. We did not know yet that the cure was coming. We just held our children close in the heat of August. We watched them play in the yard. We tried to remember what August had felt like when the only thing it had brought was the lilacs in the morning and the cicadas in the trees in the evening. August also brought the first reports of something strange happening in the skies over the United States. People were seeing things they could not explain. Lights, disks, objects moving in ways that aircraft could not move. The Air Force was investigating. The newspapers were calling them flying saucers. Most of us did not know what to think. The country was strange enough already. We added the flying saucers to the list of things we were trying not to worry about. Most of the sightings would later be explained: weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, tricks of the light. But the idea had been planted, and the idea would never leave. The 1950s would be the decade of the flying saucer. The films and the books and the radio dramas. Forbidden Planet. The Day the Earth Stood Still. War of the Worlds. We had seen the atomic bomb. We had seen what science could do. We were ready to believe that anything was possible, including visitors from other worlds. The truth was simpler. We were a country that had just learned how to destroy itself. We were a country that had just realized our enemies could destroy us too. We were a country looking at the sky with a mixture of hope and dread. Some of us saw aliens up there. Some of us saw nuclear weapons. Some of us saw both at the same time. It did not really matter. The point was that we were looking up. The sky did not feel safe anymore. Nothing did. September began with the start of the new school year. The yellow buses rolled down our streets at 7 in the morning. The kids in their new shoes and their new lunch boxes stood at the corners with their mothers waiting. The first day of school had its own particular smell. New paper, fresh-cut crayons, the wax of the new pencils, the chalk of the blackboards, the faint diesel of the school bus pulling up. The teachers in the classrooms were mostly women in their 30s and 40s. They wore dresses and stockings and sensible shoes. They taught the alphabet and the multiplication tables and how to read aloud. They taught us to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. They taught us to sing My Country 'Tis of Thee. They taught us American history that ended at the end of World War II. They taught us geography that included the Soviet Union as a vast pink area on the map. They taught us how to behave in public. They taught us, by example, how to be quiet and respectful and polite. They taught us, without saying it directly, that we were Americans and that being American was an enormous and serious responsibility. In Korea, the war turned that month. On September 15th, MacArthur's forces landed at Incheon. The landing was as audacious and as risky as anyone had predicted. The first wave hit the seawalls at Wolmido at dawn. The Marines went over the walls with rope ladders and grappling hooks. They took the island in a few hours. The main force landed at the city of Incheon proper at the next high tide that afternoon. The North Korean defenders were stunned. They had not expected an attack here. They had thought it was impossible. It was almost impossible, but the Marines did it. Within 2 weeks, the American forces had retaken Seoul. The North Korean army, cut off from its supply lines, started to crumble. The American and South Korean forces broke out of the Pusan perimeter and started pushing north. The North Korean army began a long, panicked retreat. By the end of September, the war that had looked like it was going to be lost had been completely reversed. We read about Incheon in the newspapers, and we felt a surge of pride. MacArthur was a genius after all. The Marines were the toughest fighters in the world. The American military, even after the demobilization, even with the old equipment, was still the best in the world. We could win this thing. We could go home soon. We told ourselves all of these things in September. We did not know that the war was about to get much worse. We did not know that the Chinese were watching and they were not happy. We did not know that within 2 months the Chinese army would pour across the Yalu River and the American forces would be pushed back south of the 38th parallel again, and the war would settle into a 3-year stalemate that would kill tens of thousands more of our boys. We did not know any of that yet. In September, we just knew that Incheon was a triumph. We let ourselves feel good about something. In Hollywood, a 19-year-old actress named Marilyn Monroe was making her first significant films. She had a small role in The Asphalt Jungle that summer. She had another small role in All About Eve that fall. We did not know her yet. We would know her soon enough. By 1953, she would be the biggest star in the world. By 1962, she would be dead. The autumn brought the harvest. The pumpkins were on the front porches by the end of the month. The kids carved jack-o'-lanterns at the kitchen table the week before Halloween. The leaves were turning. The mornings were cold enough to need a jacket. The country smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon and the slow burn of the year ending. In Washington, McCarthy was still waving his lists. The accusations were getting more aggressive. Hollywood was already in turmoil. The first hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee had been in 1947, 3 years earlier. The Hollywood 10 had been blacklisted in 1948. The big studios had agreed to stop hiring anyone who had ever been a communist. The screenwriters and the directors were lying low. Some of them were writing under pseudonyms. Some of them had left the country. Some of them had cooperated with the committee and named names. The naming of names had ended friendships and marriages. It would continue to do so for the next 5 years. We did not yet know that this was the worst of it. We thought it might get better. It would get worse first. In September, the FBI arrested an electrical engineer named Julius Rosenberg in his apartment in New York. He was charged with espionage. He had been the head of a small spy ring that had passed atomic secrets to the Soviets during the war. The investigation that had started with Klaus Fuchs in February had finally reached its target. Rosenberg's wife, Ethel, would be arrested a few weeks later. Their trial would begin in 1951. They would be executed in 1953. The case would split the country. It would never really heal. But all of that was still in the future. In September, all we knew was that the FBI had arrested another spy, and the news was on the radio in the morning. And we listened with our coffee, and we shook our heads and we said, how many more of them are there? The first peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in plastic wrap were sold in stores that year. We bought them and we marveled. We had been making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches by hand for our children's lunchboxes for decades. Now somebody else was doing the work for us. The prepackaged American lunch was on its way. The slow industrialization of our food supply had begun. The cars on the road were almost all American. Ford, Chevrolet, Plymouth, Dodge, Buick, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Cadillac, Lincoln, Mercury, Studebaker, Packard, Hudson, Nash, Kaiser, Fraser. We made dozens of brands. The two Volkswagens that had arrived in May were still curiosities. The Japanese auto industry did not yet exist in any meaningful way. The British and French car companies were rebuilding from the war. Detroit was the center of the automotive universe. We had no idea this would not be permanent. The kids on the streets of America were playing kick the can. They were playing red light, green light. They were playing tag. They were playing baseball in the empty lots. They were riding their bicycles in packs through the new suburban developments, the wheels rattling on the seams of the concrete sidewalks. They were going to bed when the streetlights came on. They were drinking from the garden hose. They were getting their tonsils out at the doctor's office. They were getting whooping cough and measles and chicken pox, and they were getting over them. They were the largest generation of children that the country had ever produced, and they were going to grow up to change everything. We just did not know it yet. We watched them play in the yard, and we did not see the future. We saw the children we loved. October brought the World Series, the New York Yankees against the Philadelphia Phillies. The Whiz Kids in their first World Series appearance in 35 years. The country tuned in. The Yankees swept the Phillies in 4 games. Joe DiMaggio had a quiet series. Yogi Berra hit a home run. The kid pitcher Phil Rizzuto did his job. The Phillies just could not match the Yankee experience. They went home to Philadelphia and they walked through the streets and they were greeted by huge crowds anyway, because they had made the World Series, and that was something they had not done in a generation. The autumn rolled on. The leaves came down. The kids went out trick-or-treating in their costumes on Halloween night. The costumes were homemade, ghosts in old sheets, cowboys in Dad's old hats, witches with brooms from the kitchen. The candy was simple. Tootsie Rolls, Bit-O honey bars, bubble gum. Some houses gave out apples. A few houses gave out pennies. The kids carried their candy home in paper grocery bags. They dumped it on the living room floor. They sorted it into piles. The mothers checked it for razor blades, which had not yet become a real worry, but were starting to be talked about. The fathers helped themselves to the chocolate bars. The kids ate themselves sick over the next week. Halloween in 1950 was still a small-town festival. The trick-or-treating did not stretch for blocks. The kids went around the corner and down the street, and they were home by 8. The houses had a single front porch light on. The mothers gave out the candy at the door. Everyone knew everyone. The neighborhood was a real thing. The Korean War was going well in October. The Americans had pushed past the 38th parallel and were driving north. MacArthur had announced that the boys would be home by Christmas. The newspapers carried the headline. We read it and we let ourselves believe it. Home by Christmas. After all the casualties and all the worry and all the bus station goodbyes, the boys were going to be home by Christmas. We should not have believed it. MacArthur had been wrong before. He would be wrong again. The Chinese were watching. On October 19th, the first Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River into North Korea. They did it quietly. They did it at night. They did it without any official announcement from Peking. MacArthur was told. He dismissed it. He did not think the Chinese would intervene. He did not think they had the capability. He did not think Mao would dare. Mao dared. 200,000 Chinese soldiers were inside North Korea by the end of October, hidden in the mountains, waiting. They would attack in November. They would catch the Americans by surprise. They would change the war. But for now, in October 1950, we did not know any of this. The headlines said the war was almost over. We let ourselves feel it. We started to look forward to Christmas with our boys home. Adlai Stevenson was emerging as a possible Democratic candidate for the presidency in 1952. He was the governor of Illinois. He was articulate and intellectual and unmarried, which would later become a political problem for him. We were starting to look at him as Truman's possible successor. Truman had not yet announced whether he would run for re-election. He was sick of the job. He had been doing it for 5 years. He would announce in 1952 that he would not run. Stevenson would be the Democratic candidate. Eisenhower would be the Republican candidate. Eisenhower would win in a landslide. We did not know any of that yet. October 1950 was a politically quiet month. Charlie Parker was playing in New York in October. So was Dizzy Gillespie. So was Miles Davis. The bebop revolution had been going on for 5 years. The jazz clubs in Manhattan were full every night. The new music was complicated and sophisticated and a little bit dangerous. The musicians played fast and loud, and they took drugs and they died young. The white teenagers were starting to hear the music for the first time. The seeds of the Cultural Revolution were being planted in those small, smoky clubs. We did not know it. In Hollywood, a new movie called All About Eve was in theaters. Bette Davis at her absolute peak. The movie was sharp and witty and a little bit cruel, and it would be nominated for 14 Academy Awards, more than any movie in history. We watched it and we marveled at Davis. We did not know that her career was about to crash. We did not know that within a few years, she would be having trouble finding work. The studio system was crumbling. The actors were getting older. The new generation of movie stars was arriving. Marlon Brando, James Dean, Montgomery Clift. They would change everything. We were not ready for them yet. The first Lithuanian-American daily newspaper was launched in Brooklyn. The first Polish-American radio station was launched in Chicago. The first nationwide Spanish-language television network would not be launched for another decade. The immigrants who had come to America in the 1920s and 1930s were having children. Those children were becoming American. The next generation of these families would not speak the old language. The grandparents would teach the children a few words. The children would not pass them on. The melting pot was working the way it was supposed to work, except that it was melting away an entire layer of cultural memory that we did not yet understand we would miss. October ended with the trees mostly bare, and the cold of November starting to settle into the houses. The furnaces clicked on at night. The thick wool blankets came out of the cedar chests. The first frost killed the last of the garden tomatoes. The kids dragged themselves home from school in heavier coats. The Christmas wish lists were starting to form in their heads. We had a few weeks before Thanksgiving. The country was settling into the long quiet of the year ending. November began with politics. The midterm elections were on November 7th. The Democrats had been in power in Washington for 18 straight years, since Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932. The Republicans were hungry for power. They were running on two things: the fear of communism and the conduct of the Korean War. The Democrats lost 28 seats in the House. They held on to a slim majority. The Republicans picked up 5 seats in the Senate and took the majority there. McCarthy was triumphant. He had campaigned hard for Republican candidates around the country. He had told voters that the Democrats were soft on communism. He had said that there were communists in the State Department, in the universities, in the schools, in the newspapers. He had pointed at his lists. The voters had listened. The country was starting to shift. The long Roosevelt-Truman era was coming to an end. We did not see it yet exactly, but the ground was tilting. The Republicans would win the White House in 1952. The Eisenhower years would begin. The slow movement of the country to the political right would start to accelerate. The labor unions would peak this year and then begin a long decline. The civil rights movement was about to start. The country we were living in was about to change in ways that none of us could yet see. But the most shocking moment of November 1950 had nothing to do with the elections. It happened on November 1st. 2 Puerto Rican nationalists tried to assassinate President Truman. The Trumans were living at Blair House, across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House, while the White House was being renovated. 2 men, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, walked up to Blair House that afternoon. They opened fire on the guards at the front entrance. They were trying to get inside to kill Truman. The gunfight lasted 38 seconds. Torresola killed a White House guard named Leslie Caufelt. Caufelt, dying, returned fire and killed Torresola. Collazo was wounded and captured. Truman, in his upstairs bedroom, was unharmed. He came to the window to see what was happening. The Secret Service yelled at him to get back. He got back. The country was shocked. An attempt on the president's life, right in the middle of Washington, in broad daylight. We had not had a presidential assassination since McKinley in 1901. The last attempt before that had been on Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. The president was supposed to be sacred in America. The president was supposed to be safe. Collazo would be tried and convicted and sentenced to death. Truman would commute the sentence to life in prison. Collazo would be released by President Carter in 1979 and would return to Puerto Rico, where he would live until 1994. He never expressed regret for the attempt. We read about Blair House at the kitchen table and we shook our heads. Even the president was not safe. Even Truman, the plain-spoken Missouri man with the bow tie and the glasses, who looked like everyone's uncle, even he could be a target. The country was getting more dangerous. Or maybe the country had always been this dangerous, and we had just been too busy with the war to notice. On November 26th, the Chinese army made its move in Korea. 250,000 Chinese soldiers, hidden in the mountains, attacked the American forces in the north. The Americans were caught completely by surprise. They had been told the Chinese would not intervene. MacArthur had said so. Now the Chinese had not just intervened. They had ambushed an entire American army. The disaster of the next month was about to begin. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, the longest retreat in American military history. Tens of thousands of American casualties. The temperatures dropping to 30 below zero. The Marines and the soldiers fighting their way back through the mountains, surrounded by Chinese forces. The wounded packed into trucks. The dead left behind because there was no way to carry them. Home by Christmas was no longer a phrase anyone was using. We turned on the radio at 6 in the evening and we listened to the news from Korea. The voices were grim. The reports were terrible. The casualty numbers were starting to come up. The boys were dying in a place none of us had even heard of 3 months ago. The whole country was leaning toward the speakers, trying to hear, trying to understand, trying to figure out what was happening on the other side of the world. The Thanksgiving turkey came out of the oven that year with a particular weight to it. We sat at the dinner table with our families. We held hands and said grace. We thanked God for what we had. We did not mention the boys in Korea, except to ask for their safe return. We did not mention the Russians or the Chinese or McCarthy or the Rosenbergs. We just ate the turkey and the mashed potatoes and the gravy and the cranberry sauce, and we passed the rolls, and we talked about the kids and the neighbors and the weather. We were Americans. We knew how to be Americans. We knew how to hold a family together in a hard year. We had been doing it for a long time. We were going to keep doing it. The hum-clunk of the refrigerator was the same. The percolator was the same. The morning paper still landed on the front step with that soft, familiar thwap. But underneath all of it was the steady awareness that the war had taken a terrible turn, and our boys were paying the price. December was hard. The retreat from the Chosin Reservoir was happening as we trimmed our Christmas trees. The boys were dying in sub-zero temperatures while we hung the lights from our eaves. The Marines were carrying their dead and their wounded back through the mountains while we wrapped the presents in colored paper and put them under the tree. We read the casualty lists every day. We searched for names we knew. The lists were long. The lists were going to keep being long for the next 3 years. Truman declared a state of national emergency on December 15th. He called for a major mobilization of the economy. War production was going to be ramped up. The civilian factories were going to start making weapons again. The country was going to be on a war footing. The peace we had thought we earned 5 years ago was officially over. We read Truman's speech in the newspaper. He was a plain-spoken man. He did not waste words. He told the country what the situation was. The Chinese had entered the war. The American forces were in retreat. The situation was grave. The country needed to be prepared for a long, hard fight. We listened. We had heard speeches like this before. We had been here. We knew what was coming. Some of us went back to the war plants we had worked at in the early 1940s. Some of us put our boys on the buses to the recruiting stations. Some of us watched our husbands pack their duffel bags for the second time in a decade. There was a particular tiredness in our houses that December. We had earned our peace. We had been ready to enjoy it. We had filled our refrigerators and bought our televisions and started our families and moved into our new houses in the new suburbs. And then the world had come and taken our peace away. The Christmas tree in the corner of the living room had its colored lights on. The presents were under it, wrapped in red and green paper, tied with ribbons. The children sat on the floor and shook the boxes and tried to guess what was inside. The radio was playing Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. The percolator was on in the kitchen. The smell of turkey was starting to fill the house. We had this. We had each other. We had our families. We had our homes. Whatever the world was about to do to us, it could not take that away. We had survived the Depression. We had survived the war. We were going to survive this too. That was the deal Americans had made with themselves. We did not give up. We did not despair. We did not stop. We just kept going. We just got up in the morning and we made the coffee and we read the paper and we went to work and we came home and we ate dinner and we put the kids to bed and we said goodnight to each other and we did it again the next day. We did it through the worst years of the Depression. We did it through the war. We were going to do it through whatever was coming next. The presents got opened on Christmas morning. The kids screamed when they saw the new bicycles and the new dolls and the new train sets. The dads put together the toys with the wrong screwdrivers and bandaged up their thumbs. The moms watched it all from the kitchen doorway, drinking coffee, smiling. The grandparents arrived with more presents in the afternoon. The dinner table was set for 10. We pulled out the extra leaf. We pulled out the good china. We said grace. We ate. We laughed. We argued about politics for 15 minutes and then stopped because it was Christmas. We had pie afterward. We sang carols around the piano if there was a piano. We listened to the radio if there wasn't. The kids went to bed with their new toys. The grandparents went home. The dishes got washed. The dads sat in the living room with a glass of bourbon and watched the lights blink on the tree. The moms came in and sat down beside them. The house was quiet. We had made it through 1950, the first year of the second half of the 20th century. The year we had thought was going to be the start of an easy, prosperous, peaceful decade. The year the war had come back. The year McCarthy had started waving his lists. The year the polio had peaked. The year the spies had been arrested. The year our boys had started dying in Korea. But also the year we had moved into the new houses. The year we had bought the new appliances. The year the television had started taking over. The year the credit card had been invented. The year we had finally let ourselves believe that the long bad time was over. We had held both things at once all year, the terror and the comfort, the bomb and the lullaby, the war and the wedding, the casualty list and the Christmas list. We had held them and we had not dropped them, even as our hands shook. That was what 1950 was, the year we learned that the peace we had won was not going to be simple. The peace was going to come with conditions. The peace was going to come with its own terrors. The peace was going to require us to keep being brave in ways we had thought we were finished being brave. The hum-clunk of the refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen at the end of Christmas Day. The lights on the tree blinked red and green and yellow and blue in the dark of the living room. The presents were unwrapped. The wrapping paper was in the trash. The kids were asleep. The dads were in their chairs. The moms were on the couch. The radio was off. The whole country was settling into the last week of the strangest year of our adult lives. We did not yet know that 1951 was going to be the year of Lucy. We did not know that 1952 was going to be the year of polio at its worst. We did not know that 1953 was going to be the year the war finally ended and Stalin died and Hugh Hefner started Playboy. We did not know that 1954 was going to bring the Supreme Court decision that cracked the foundation of segregation. We did not know that 1955 was going to bring Rosa Parks and Disneyland and Emmett Till and the polio vaccine all in the same year. We did not know that the decade was going to ask us harder questions every single year, and that we were going to answer some of them right and some of them very, very wrong. We just sat in our living rooms on the last day of December 1950, looking at the Christmas tree, listening to the house settle, and thinking about what we had been through. We had been through a lot. We were going to be through a lot more. But the kids were asleep upstairs in their own beds, in their own rooms. The dog was curled up by the radiator. The wife, husband, was next to us on the couch. The refrigerator was humming. The percolator was clean and ready for morning. The newspaper would arrive at the front step tomorrow with that soft, familiar thwap. We had everything we needed. We had each other. That was the deal. That was always the deal. The world was always going to try to take it away. We were always going to refuse to let it. This was the year America was just getting started. If you traveled the whole year with us, from the cold morning of January 1st to the dim Christmas light of December 31st, do me a favor. Write a comment below and start it with the word percolator. Then just share whatever is on your mind. A memory, a smell, a sound, something your mother used to say. Something you still hear when the house is quiet and the year is ending. Other people will not know why you started with that word. It will be our small secret between us, and it will mean that you walked all 12 months of 1950 with me. I am curious about something else too. Which part of 1950 hit you hardest? If it was the early months when the country was still hopeful and the war had not yet come, hit the subscribe button on this channel. If it was the late months when the world had turned and the Chinese were across the Yalu and our boys were freezing in the Chosin Reservoir, leave a like on this video. That way I will know which 1950 stayed with you. Next year, we are going to do the same thing for 1951. Every year of the decade. Every year of the next 2 decades. All of it, year by year. The big stories and the small stories and the smells of the kitchen and the sound of the radio in the evening. The whole American century. I will see you in 1951. Take care of yourselves between now and then. Thanks for taking this trip down memory lane with us. We will see you in the next one.